Alright, this is my lesson study final. So a little background about where my practicum was at. I was in an 8th grade science class at Goodrich Middle School. My CT was Tim DePay. We had 24 students in our class. 9 of them were females, 15 were males, and 7 of our students had special needs. 2 of them were ELL. And you can see the student demographics there. It's a very diverse school. For my first lesson, the objective was that students will know the positions of the planets. The 2 standards that were addressed were that students would develop and use a model to describe the role of gravity and the motions within galaxies and the solar system, as well as analyze and interpret data to determine scale properties of objects in the solar system. And really the only misconception that I could think of and that held true was the misunderstanding about the distance between the planets, especially the outer planets. Students have a hard time grasping the idea of how far apart the outer planets actually are. And here's my 5E lesson plan. To start out, for an Engage, I had the students draw out a chart, kind of like a graphic organizer, and students were asked to estimate how many days it would take to travel in a spaceship from the sun to each planet. And they used their notes that they previously had written down that had the distance of the planets from the sun in miles, but this was a nice way for them to put a unit on them that they could actually understand pretty easily. For the Explorer, students were given a list of procedures to follow to make their own solar system model, as well as 3 questions to answer. We walked through these procedures together step by step. Students had to draw the sun, all 8 planets, the asteroid belt, the moon, and a satellite, with the option of adding Pluto, and they did this on a long strip of paper. The explain portion kind of went with my Engage, it came before the Explore, I guess. Students shared their estimations from the Engage activity and were asked to explain how they came up with their answers in front of the class, so it was kind of a whole class discussion for the Engage activity. To elaborate, we reviewed the answers to the 3 questions the students were asked to answer the following day. So we went over it the next day. And to evaluate, students estimated the amount of days it would take to travel from the sun to each planet after I gave them the answer for 2 planets, and using their notes from the previous week. Students also had to answer 3 reflective questions using their solar system model, which includes observations, compare, contrast, and a what would happen if question. And here are the results from the assessment, looking at 3 different students. A 3-question worksheet was given to the students, which asked critical questions comparing the distances of the planets, more specifically the distance between the outer planets and the inner planets. And student A demonstrated clear understanding of the positions of all 8 planets, why the outer planets are further apart than the inner planets, and what would happen if the outer planets were as close as the inner planets. Student B demonstrated clear understanding of the position of all 8 planets, why the outer planets are further apart than the inner planets, but they struggled with what would happen if the outer planets were as close as the inner planets. And finally, student C demonstrated clear understanding of the positions of all 8 planets, but they struggled with answering why the outer planets are farther apart than the inner planets, and what would happen if the outer planets were as close as the inner planets. For lesson 2, my objective was that students will know that vibration causes sound. The standard addressed here was that students would recognize that vibrations set up a wave-like disturbance that spread away from the source, which is what sound is. The misconception here is that students know sound is produced from some sort of collision, but they have a hard time grasping the fact that it is the vibrations that actually cause the sound. To dispute this misconception right away, I had students put their hands on their throats and start talking, which allowed them to feel the vibration in their voice box. Here's my 5E lesson plan for the day. To Engage, students were read true-false questions about the ear. These questions were centered around difficult but interesting facts that they were not aware of at the time. This really got them engaged in the topic for the day. And we also talked about ears the following week, so this was a good transition. To explore, students were given a list of procedures to follow to develop a better understanding that vibration causes sound and that different tuning forks cause different sounds. I briefly covered each step, then allowed them to move at their own pace. Questions at the end of this procedure asked them to come up with and describe real-world examples of different pitches. To explain, students shared their findings from the tuning fork activity and gave their examples aloud so the class could develop a better understanding of the concept with multiple examples. So again, we had another whole class discussion. To elaborate, we reviewed the entire lesson briefly the following day to reiterate that vibration causes sound. And to evaluate, students were asked to hypothesize what would happen in different scenarios by putting the tuning fork in water or looking at different size tuning forks and striking forks harder and softer, and shared their hypotheses in class. Students also had to answer multiple questions using tuning forks to show their understanding that sound is caused by vibrations. Here was the assessment. A guided worksheet with 12 questions was given to the students testing their understanding of sound, vibration, pitch, and frequency, and how they relate to one another. So student A was able to demonstrate clear understanding that vibration causes sound, that frequency affects pitch, and they were able to come up with their own examples. Student B demonstrated clear understanding that vibration causes sound and frequency affects pitch, but they struggled to come up with their own examples. And student C demonstrated a clear understanding that vibration causes sound. However, they struggled by learning that frequency affects pitch, and they struggled coming up with their own examples. To compare my two lessons, I really had two things that I changed. The first change I made allowed students to work at their own pace. While many students move quicker than others and lose focus when waiting, the second change I made asked the students more specific questions to see exactly what they were and were not understanding when it came time to revisit material. So for lesson 1, I went through the procedures step by step with the students, so everybody moved at the same pace. However, some students finished steps early and had nothing to do, and this lost their focus. So for lesson 2, I changed that by reading through all the procedures first before turning the students loose. This allowed students to move at their own pace, and students were provided work to do if they finished early. Back at lesson 1, students had just 3 broad questions to answer. However, this did not show specific understandings or misunderstandings. So for lesson 2, I had students have 12 questions on a worksheet, which were more specific, and this allowed for better understandings on my part to see what they actually did understand and did not understand. So in conclusion, having an assessment plan during lesson 2 with more questions allowed me to have more concrete evidence of what students did and did not understand. This is especially important with material that will be touched on later during a quiz, test, or related material. I allowed students to work at different rates because many students finished certain procedures early during lesson 1 and had nothing to do while waiting to progress. Allowing students to work at their own pace keeps them busy, but some sort of work must be provided upon finishing early. My CT is the only source cited because we both together came up with the 2 activities.